LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat and my guest today is Gary Evans, and together we will be listening to the past. Many ancient sites such as the Great Pyramid in Egypt and Stonehenge in England appear to have unusual acoustic properties which suggest that these places had a purpose not yet recognised by mainstream archaeology. Resonating frequencies and other forms of sound have long been associated with altered states of consciousness and other spiritual and mystical experiences. Certain properties of many ancient sites indicate that they were designed to focus, concentrate, and in some cases generate powerful energies, including sound. Is it possible that they served a sacred ceremonial function intended to affect the brain and body, taking us beyond our crude intellect and into a more intuitive state of mind? The building methods used on many ancient sites also remain a mystery to us. Is it possible that sound played a part in their construction? Were the massive blocks of stone used in places like the Great Pyramid and Stonehenge perhaps quarried, transported and lifted into place by some subtle technology now lost in the mists of time? Although there appear to be more questions than answers, the evidence suggests that in high antiquity humans thought very differently than they do now. Their entire worldview and concept of what was possible seems radically different from our own, based on a more integrated state of mind unburdened by the left brain dominance that is responsible for much of the chaos and destruction in the world today. In looking back, maybe we can learn how to move forward. Hello and welcome, Gary, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Now, today, Gary, we're going to be talking about all manner of things to do with ancient sites such as the Great Pyramids, Stonehenge, pyramids and megaliths all over the world with regard to not only the acoustic properties and some of the ramifications for that, but also how our experience of these places, the experience that a lot of people have today as tourists, can be enhanced and transformed really and be brought much closer to how these sites perhaps would have been experienced when they were pristine. Before we dive into all of that, I just tell listeners a bit about yourself and your background and how you came to be involved in this area to start with.
Yes, sure. Well, I've been researching, you could say, the mysteries of the planet, ancient history, subjects like kind of shamanism, altered states of consciousness, and all these kind of things since I was about 17. I used to absorb a lot of information back before the internet, and had various periods of research while I was working in the corporate world. And then in 2009, I started to go to yoga, and you could say I had some kind of an awakening or more clarity on really what I wanted to do with my life. And at the early part of 2010, I was starting to help with website design for some alternative history conferences. And that led me to being in contact with a lot of the authors in this kind of world, American and US authors. And it quickly became apparent that with my background in kind of sales and marketing, that there was a niche area in this world for a PR person for a lot of the authors. And very early on, I was working with Graham Hancock and Walter Crussenden in America, and Gregory Sams in England, Lucy Wyatt, who I'm now organising a conference in London in July, Eternal Knowledge. And so over the years, I've worked on various conferences and tours to ancient sites, because part of my personal journey was going to conferences, meeting like-minded people, having discussions, making new friends that had read the same books as me, watched the same documentaries, and it was very empowering. Suddenly I had this circle of friends I could discuss all these subjects with that my previous circle of friends kind of entertained me, but they weren't really into it in the same way that I was. So now I like to work on these events that encourages people to come together, meet new friends, listen to the authors that inspire them, and likewise on the tours. And it's been a bit of a roller coaster since 2010. Probably covered 100 to 150,000 miles traveling to ancient sites and conferences in the US. And 2014 looks like another busy year.
In a previous conversation that you and I had sort of privately, so to speak, with my other hat on as a musician and music journalist, I was talking to you about how interested I was in the acoustic properties of some of these ancient sites, and it turns out that's a great interest to you as well. Mm-hmm. Now, there's been quite a lot of coverage recently regarding Stonehenge in the mainstream media, certainly here in the UK anyway. That's cropped up again. I mean, it's been ongoing for some time, but it comes up every now and again, it seems, with increasing frequency. So perhaps you could just give us a rundown of how you first got interested in that particular area, because I know that you've been out to Egypt, to the pyramids, and had some very interesting experiences there.
Yes, and well, I went to Egypt as part of organising a tour with Robert Baval in 2010, and it was more of on my second tour in 2011. I became connected to Patricia and Yusuf Awiyan, who Yusuf's father was Hakim Awiyan, who was a tour guide for sort of American senators, and he had the Giza Plateau as he said, he passed in 2008 as his playground in the 1930s, before a lot of what's now got metal grates and these doors and things over them, where he used to be able to just crawl around to his heart's content back then. So a lot of places that we can't get to anymore, he had a good understanding, and even one story, he said that he crawled under the ground from Giza quite a few miles and came up, I think it was near Saqqara. So all of these sites he was seeing were connected underneath the ground, and by going into the Great Pyramid with Patricia and Yusuf, what Hakim had also made them interested in was the acoustic properties, particularly of the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid. And I mean, I work with a lot of authors, and of course, I mean, there must be thousands, tens of thousands of theories about the Great Pyramid. We've all heard different people's pet theories. But one thing that you can't argue about is the fact that there are very interesting acoustics inside the Great Pyramid. I've been there with Chris Dunn, and if you just look at it from an engineering perspective, if it was to act as a tomb, then it's incredibly over-engineered for a tomb. If you wanted a chamber up where the King's Chamber is, there was a lot easier ways to do that. And various features, and particularly the Grand Gallery, just tell you that something else was going on, and it's incredibly sensitive to sound. So what I started to see in Egypt was the engineering was there for acoustics. We, as individuals and as groups, can use those sound frequencies to have these very interesting experiences, and I've lost count of the amount of experiences. And normally what I like to do, to use as an example, because we do need a bit of science to back this up, so I normally direct people in the direction of my recent article where I've referenced research that's being done at UCLA, because most of us probably aren't aware of the effects of different acoustic frequencies on the brain. And they used an EEG machine, and they measured between 90 and 130 hertz, and they found around 110 hertz the hemispheres of our brain basically it harmonizes or syncs up. So if we're the normal way of looking at it is we're more sort of left brain rational minded dominant would be the better way to put it. And so we move into the intuitive space when we're in these sound frequencies. And during their measurements at UCLA Mindfulness Research Center, they found that 110 hertz, that seems to be the magic number. That's where this the kind of intuitive dominance starts to take more effect. And when we look at a lot of these sites, and the measurements have been done by Stanford and other universities, we find time and time again that these places are tuned around 110 hertz, 103 to 110 hertz. And so our ancestors, in my opinion, were fully aware of how to get into this intuitive space. And when you're in that frame of mind, you can kind of get these huge epiphanies, like a whole concept of how something works, rather than our rational kind of scientific approach. And certain people through history seem to have been able to tap into that space. And you can look at a lot of even the recent geniuses, like Einstein, has quite a few quotes about intuition, and Bruce Lee and Nikola Tesla, people like that. So certain individuals through our history have definitely tapped into this for power of moving us forwards.
Yeah, this left-right brain thing has been subject of some recent interviews I've done, including one with Walter Cruttenden, and it seems really, really important because we're currently left brain dominated, most of us, and that's certainly the tendency that's shaping events in the world. And to engage, to have sort of a unity of mind would really help to rebalance the world, because we're seriously out of balance at the moment.
Yeah, driving is one that I really notice it. If I'm in a conference setting and I kind of get into this very heady space and thinking very deeply about things, and I get back in my car, sometimes it can be very difficult to get back into that mindset. So it seems like I have to change the way of thinking completely to get back to this rational, logical way of thinking that we use for computing, and of course our most of our sciences revolve around that perspective. So we've swayed our civilization and way of life, particularly in the West, to be very rational, dominant. And most people understand that there is intuition. We aren't generally taught to nurture that quality. It's not really part of most of our schooling systems. So it's something, an innate ability that I believe we all have. And so there are ways to nurture that ability. And I don't think it's too late for any of us, because, I was in my late 30s before I started to get into this. And as soon as you start putting a bit of energy and effort in that direction, it's like you just sort of flick a switch. So that's my take on things.
So as far as, for example, the ancient Egyptians, obviously that covers a long period of time, and we're not just talking about Egypt here, we're talking about ancient cultures all over the world. The purpose then of, at least partly, of some of these constructions would have been to access those sort of altered states of consciousness, or more of a unity of mind, as I referred to.
Well, when we're talking about ancient Egyptians, and it's definitely a good distinction, we're definitely looking at the oldest phase of the building. Modern dating has pushed Stonehenge back. They're saying sort of 3 to 3,500 BC now. We've still got stuck with this date of 2,500 BC or thereabouts for the building of the Great Pyramid. But whenever that period was, the very early stage of construction, the master builders, which I think we really should call them, because whether we can replicate some of their feats today is arguable. Certainly not to last 5,000 years. I think that's where we would definitely fail. So if you have a civilization, and you have to, I think, start bringing in either what we could call spirituality or self-development practices, that the idea that we all have a soul that survives death, and you come to Earth with some kind of purpose or growth in mind. This is a general concept in metaphysical circles. But if you had a civilization founded on that as your understanding, then some of your biggest goals would, of course, be on how to raise your awareness and grow your soul's understanding. So I think that was definitely a core part of their belief system. Whether anyone listening wants to believe it's true or not is down to them.
Well, as I mentioned earlier about myself being a musician and writing about music for over a quarter of a century, I have to admit that's how long it's been now. I've always had a great interest in the transformational power of music. You know, the old cliche is it's the universal language, but for me, there's always been more to it than just something that you maybe pick up at the checkout at Tesco or at the filling station. Just, oh, I need another CD for the car or whatever. These days, you know, downloads, music's so cheap, nobody expects to pay anything for it anymore, and it's something that you have on your headphones while you're doing the shopping, whatever it happens to be, and it cheapens it. And I've always thought that music fundamentally was much more important than that. And I think there's, you know, you could look at the importance of music, singing and dancing in ancient cultures. We begin to get an understanding of this. And I had a conversation in my day job a few years ago with a gentleman called Carl McCoy, and his band's called Fields of the Nephilim, which is interesting in itself. Mm-hmm. And we got into this area, and he was talking about, certainly he sees his music as, and his term was, you know, nothing less than modern shamanism.
And what kind of music was that?
Fields of the Nephilim are a gothic rock band, but they have a very hypnotic, trance-like quality about many of their songs, particularly the later ones. And I observed the behaviour of people at their concerts, and I have to say it was like a ceremony.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can certainly understand that, because I was quite into dancing in my younger years, and there is definitely a space where you get into where you kind of feel this freedom. You definitely get out of your head a bit more and into the body, and you kind of, there's a point where you don't have to think about dancing to the music, you're just kind of moving in time. So I think many of us appreciate being able to get into that space. It's definitely a relief, and it feels good. So I can certainly empathise with what they were saying with their music, and I definitely feel like I found a way of reaching a similar place without alcohol or anything else these days. At the ancient sites, the sense of freedom when we use sound and we meditate at these places, and the connection to the world and the animals and the people around you is just incredible. You just get to this place where you could say it's beyond intellectual. You just instinctively have a much deeper understanding of the interactions of the world around you, and we've shared many experiences like that in groups. So I've spoken to people, they've given me their reports on what they experience. So it's not like it's just something that I feel, something we share in groups. Many of us get it. So really, I just try to make people think about the different options at disposal. If you're interested in ancient sites, then there's ways of interacting. As I mentioned in my recent article, I just wanted to put all of my different techniques that I use, trying to get a taste of what perhaps our ancestors were doing at these places, because after spending a lot of time at ancient sites, and I'm definitely like to study people, and my approach is just to sit there quietly and kind of tune in anyway, which lends itself to me seeing the world going past in front of my eyes, and various things come to my attention. And so I don't think many of us have perhaps thought about how we interact with sacred space, the different ways of interacting at an ancient site to how we would go to a city, for example. And if we do want to have some of these interesting experiences, we need to just set aside our modern technology and things for a while, because they definitely pull us out of the present moment and act as a big distraction.
Well, I've never been to Egypt or South America for that matter, any of these more remote, remote if you're based in the UK, places. Mm-hmm. But I do like to go to the sort of places you describe, the Stonehenges of this world. And one thing that vexes me a little bit is when I see people in places like this, even if you go to medieval sites, people walking around with their headphones on, their little guided tour that they're listening to. Yeah. And then there's the commercialization of these places. I mean, obviously, we can't get anywhere really near Stonehenge anymore. And I know there were some issues when people could just walk around the stones and touch them and sit on them and everything else. But these days, I think it's gone too far the other way. As I say, commercializing them, gift shops, cafes, signs everywhere, noise, coach parks, litter. And it's almost like the least important thing about the day trip seems to be the site itself.
Yeah. And I mean, it is a double-edged sword. I've thought about these subjects a lot. Stonehenge, I mean, it did unfortunately need to be protected. You couldn't just let people go in and out. I don't know what would be left of it now. Of course, it's always a very few, the minority, that spoil it for the majority. And I have heard about it's graffiti and things. Still, some people like to leave their mark on a place in that way. But it is very sad for the people that visit them with respect, and they would never do anything like that because now they're kept behind a rope unless they pay extra for a private visit. So that's what we do on our tours. We normally do it early in the morning or later in the evening when it's closed to the public. We get an hour, and then you can go inside the stones. The security guards are there to keep an eye on you, and but they don't mind you meditating. And there is a power. It is a very powerful place still. How powerful it was originally in terms of this kind of atmosphere, but there's definitely a very powerful atmosphere there still. And it is one of the places that I feel a greater connection to my intuition. So we can go there if we've got these kind of big questions about life. I would definitely list it on my locations for people to go to, should they get the opportunity. But unfortunately, the headphones, as you say, is another commercialisation, and that one's pretty intrusive, particularly for my way of approaching the sites. For example, in Egypt, quite often you'll walk into the temples and you have this beautiful bird song. It's almost like the temples are alive. Occasionally you have cats that live in the temples that walk out to greet you. So immediately if you put headphones on, you're going to cut out this beautiful bird song, like the chorus that surrounds you. And it is definitely like a little orchestra. It's just amazing sound effects. And it makes you go very inward rather than my approach, which is to try and expand the senses, use our peripheral vision and be more aware of our surroundings. But we all have our different paths, and I think we will get there at some point. So, I mean, I don't try and force anything on anybody. And perhaps once people have visited these places once and they've had the guided tour, they'd be inclined to go back and visit it without the guided tour. So you can never see where other people's paths lead. But if anyone contacts me and says, Gary, I like your approach, of course, I'm happy to share what works for me with them.
Now, if we're talking about sound at these sorts of sites and the effect it would have, on our consciousness, it's worth noting that sound does affect us at a fundamental level. We think of our everyday environment and the sounds that are there, and it's like, well, yeah, but it's not really affecting us. But when you start to get more extreme frequencies, low and high, then you begin to feel, effects that you can feel. We've all, well, presumably many of us have been perhaps to a rock concert or something and felt a very loud sound in their chest, felt it resonate in there. And it seems that at cellular or perhaps even DNA level, that certain types of sound in certain conditions could have fundamental physical effects.
Yes, and that is something that we do. We can access it very directly in the Great Pyramid in the King's Chamber, and also the Serapeum. I'm not sure if you've spoken to anyone about the Serapeum, which is a site at Saqqara. It's like basically an underground. There's a long corridor, and off of this long corridor, which I guess probably a couple of 100 feet long, there's niches off of this corridor, and in each of these niches is one of these huge, many of them are made out of granite. Most people would call them a large sarcophagus, because that's what we've been told these boxes in Egypt were used for. But they're 80 tons. So that's about 80 family cars worth of weight. So they're massive boxes. My Egyptian friends Yusuf and Patricia say, Gary, please don't call them sarcophagus, please call them resonance boxes, because they have lids on them. But there's enough room in each one. They're perfectly machined, and you could probably fit comfortably 8 to 10 people in them. But I normally clamber inside one with two or three other people, and they're finely tuned like an instrument. And so I had an Australian lady, Karen, and a gentleman in there at the end of 2012. And when I found the pitch of resonance of the box, Karen described it as it was like she was descending in an aircraft, and actually she could feel like the air pressure was changing around her. So you feel the sound waves coming off the walls of this box and penetrating into the body. So sometimes there's sound waves that are subaudible, and that's when our sense of touch can sense them, but we can't hear it. So they seem to be using those kind of sound frequencies. And from using them, the lower frequencies, on multiple occasions, I could only describe the effect of the lower frequencies as having some kind of a cleansing effect on the body. Because after using them many times, I've walked out of the Great Pyramid and just felt like I was so light that I was almost going to float off of the floor. So it's like it removes this kind of weight off of my shoulders. You have an amazing glowing feeling on the skin, like you've just had a good sauna or something. Quite often these deep epiphanies will happen at that point. If perhaps you're wondering about something, you'll suddenly see it from a completely different perspective. So that's the kind of lower frequencies side of it. And then the higher frequencies, and I've developed a few techniques. I'm going to be doing a few workshops this year, because we don't need to be at ancient sites. We can do it at sort of yoga centres, meditation groups, working with sound in a group. And the higher frequencies definitely has an effect on our awareness, and it's almost like we're getting involved in like the Kundalini energy, and this is why I believe the serpent motifs are around a lot of these sites, because there's a connection with the energy system in our body, our consciousness, and it does unfold up the spine like this serpent. And I speak from experience of having witnessed this inside me, because I've become quite sensitive to energies through experience of visiting the sites, but also the yoga practice helps that I follow.
Well, perhaps we could speculate about perhaps some of the technology involved here, because a lot of these ancient sites, we see blocks of stone, oftentimes in ruins, but the crystalline nature of a lot of the building materials is significant, I think, and there's even connections between sound and the location of water as well. So perhaps we could just speculate a little bit in that area.
Yeah, well, there is a lot of evidence, and if we do focus on Egypt, because there's just so much there, and one of the lectures I give, I do go into the kind of crystal side of it. So if I had to speculate, their technology revolved around crystal, and it's a kind of quartz crystal, alabaster crystal they were building buildings out of. They were connecting water to crystal. We've got these huge crystal basins, which are about just over a metre across, and they're at Abu Gharaib. So they've got water and crystal, or some kind of fluid and crystal, and then we've got sound as another element. And my understanding from just looking on the ground would be that their technology, which affected consciousness, sound and vibrational understandings, is also another, you could look at another arm of it, was helping them move the blocks at some point. The master builders definitely had a way of vibrating these huge blocks that are 80, 100 tons. I mean, we've got obelisks in the Aswan quarry. The broken obelisk is 1,200 tons, and they were using the Nile to transport them, but once you've got it up the Nile to your location, you've still got to move it onto the site. So from our perspective, the bigger blocks are harder to move, but if they've got a crystal, which is the common theme, crystalline granite, sandstone at Stonehenge, these dolerite stones have got crystal. Crystal is what we see in England, Egypt, Peru, and it was a favourite element of the megalith builders.
There's a reason why in all our little New Age boutiques that crystals are always so popular. I think there's something very significant there. I mean, let's not forget that crystals of various types play a very important part in modern technology. It's just not something that we really join the dots with, I think, in our mind.
Yeah, and well, I mean, if you go back into the records, and I have looked at crystals, because I mean, in some circles they've got a bit of definitely got the woo-woo reputation. A lot of people do kind of frown upon people that interact with crystals. But if we go back into the archaeological record, around a similar time period, you can see objects in the British Museum, Cairo Museum, 2,500 BC. People were wearing crystals, not just for the aesthetic qualities, but because they were understood to have these subtle influences on on the energy system of the body. And because of the vibratory nature, I guess, how they formed in the earth, and this kind of thing. And then as we've gone through history, they were more revered for their colour, and of course diamonds and things like that have huge significance for people getting married. So we definitely lost touch of that, and it's got to the point where they do have a bad reputation in many circles, and it's a way to tell somebody that's just kind of new age and a bit out there. But if you work with crystals, the thing that you realise is that you're dealing with something that's a very, very subtle. So our kind of modern generation that's used to fast results and things like that, yeah, okay, well, you can dismiss them. If that's the mindset and that's your expectations with crystals, then I'll be very surprised if you got much out of it. But if you gave them time, work with them over a period of months, perhaps years, then I would argue if you combine the subtle effects that these crystals can have with other sort of healing modalities and metaphysical teachings, that no, they're not going to change your life by themselves, but they are a potential for helping you grow.
And of course, there's the idea about the origin of crowns as typically worn by royalty. Mm-hmm. That quite often these made of precious metals, usually back in ancient times, they're then basically used to mount a crystal or other precious stone, in the center of the forehead, more sort of mimic a so-called third eye, pineal gland, that location, and that there was a practical purpose for that. It wasn't just to look good.
Well, there is a very incriminating photo of me wearing a headpiece similar to what you've just described. Yusuf and Patricia do have these crystal headpieces, and of course they're for ladies predominantly. They're not making them for men. Some of the guests on our tours purchased them, and I'd seen people enjoying them before. So on our last tour in 2013, I said to one of the guests, "Well, do you want to just try one of these headpieces out?" And it's like a ring of crystals that go around the top of your head. There's a huge one in the middle that goes straight into what you would say where the crown chakra is, and then a big one that drops down in front of the third eye. So she put it on and sat down in the chair, and I went off to look after some other guests and came back half an hour later. She was still in the chair and completely blissed out. And I again ran away again, and I was looking after some guests. They were doing some other things, and I came back, and it must have been, I think, about an hour in total. And she was still in the chair, and she looked like she was having such an amazing time. And so I asked her about it, and she said it just had this incredible feeling in her head. So being one that likes to experiment with different things, I did feel like I needed to give it a try. And I have to say, it does give you quite an intense kind of tingling sensation around the head. I won't be adding it to my explorer outfit anytime soon, but yeah, it's definitely quite a palpable effect. So the crowns, when you've got these rubies and diamonds and sapphires and things, I mean, there is this connection. I think that's why the traditions come down, particularly with the gold, which is a good conductor of these kind of subtle energies. We use gold in our electronics for its low resistance properties, and we think the Great Pyramid possibly had a gold capstone. So yes, you can see that some of these things have been used by royalty and still continues today.
Now, you mentioned the possibility of the pyramid having a gold capstone, and recently I stumbled upon an illustration, a painting basically, that someone had done. It might have been computer generated, but it looked like it was old school rendering, and it was showing Stonehenge more or less how it would have been when it was pristine. And even looking at this thing was amazing. It was just, you think Stonehenge is amazing now, just to consider what it might have been when it was, freshly completed, when they laid the last stone and said, we're done. And in the conversation I referred to earlier that we had prior to this interview, you speculated a little bit about how the pyramid might have been when it was pristine. And really, it's amazing to consider that we look at these sites now and are agog. But if we could transport ourselves back to when they were new, it would be even more incredible.
Yes, and that is something that I constantly get frustrated with when I'm on location. It's like I really need the time machine, because you kind of get a sense sometimes. And one of the most amazing places that I regularly go to is the temple in front of the Sphinx Temple. So if you walk in there today, you can see the remains of a crystal floor, and it was about, about 1/6 to 1/8 of a meter thick crystal flooring, and the granite on the walls was polished to such a high extent, and you can see it in a few places, that it acts as a mirror. And what we can see is that this temple, we're going to call it, had a granite ceiling, and in a few places there's slots cut, and the sunlight would have probably come in through these slots. That seems a logical line of thought. They seem to have been directing the sunlight at certain places in this temple. So back in the day, when it was bright sun coming through these slots in the ceiling, I can just imagine walking into this temple, and it would have been almost like a hall of mirrors at the circus or something, with these kind of multiple reflections of yourself. I mean, you've got this brilliant white crystal floor that's reflecting. All of the walls are like mirrors, and the sun's going to be kind of dancing around. Perhaps they did direct it into certain places. So we're really, interacting with the world in an entirely different way to how we do most of the time now.
And if the Great Pyramid, for example, had a white outer coating and a gold capstone, just imagine in a bright sunny afternoon coming over the horizon and seeing that thing ahead of you.
Well, we've got various reports that as soon as you kind of came over the horizon, it was like a lighthouse in the desert. That's quite a common old report, and also that it was probably emitting some kind of a humming sound. That's also come down to us. So it has, unfortunately, with the loss of the casing stones and probably a few other areas that have been damaged over the course of the centuries, been decommissioned to a certain extent, but we can still get a taste by going inside today. The Ben stone, I don't think they've got the one from the Great Pyramid, but that's the capstone, and there's a few in the Cairo Museum. I mean, they normally say it was covered with a combination, I think it was electrum, sort of gold and silver, and that's about the best that we know. But definitely, we've had people going up there fairly recently, and they use these kind of Leyden jars, and they get an electric charge on the platform at the top of the Great Pyramid. So there is natural electricity or electrical charge building up in the structure even today.
Well, you mentioned a possibility of emitting a humming sound. Of course, there was that similar speculation about Stonehenge in the right conditions, emitting a low throb, almost like a bass synthesizer.
Yeah, because the work of Chris Dunn, his book, The Giza Power Plant, he was one of the first people to make me start thinking about it in terms of a giant machine. And due to the size of them, we have to, I think, go well beyond the fact that these sites were just being used for people to go into and create sound. One of the big areas that I'm hoping some of our scientists are going to start looking into more is this idea of what I call sympathetic resonance. When you have the opera singer that's singing and you have the glass close by and she hits a certain note and the glass explodes. Well, that kind of similar principle, these sites suggest to me that they were amplifying these natural either vibrations from the earth, these natural energies, or perhaps just at certain times. I like if there was a big shift in the tectonics, or there was an earthquake, which occasionally do hit the Great Pyramid. That's known. That it could send the setup into some kind of a resonance and sympathetic resonance that goes on for a while. Or one other area is that they could have just been amplifying the sound of running water, particularly in the Great Pyramid. We're pretty sure that there was running water in the subterranean chamber, there's a shaft that goes straight down at the bottom of the Great Pyramid, and we know that there's running water. The Nile was coming up. And there's a few other places on the Giza Plateau where you can see a connection between sound chambers and shafts that go down, and there would have been running water at the bottom of these shafts. So some kind of interaction between running water and sound. And at Stonehenge, it's the chalk is similar to the limestone bedrock at the Giza Plateau, and of course we have a lot of rain in England, and it looks like that was the case thousands and thousands of years ago again. So there are many similarities. The megalith master builders definitely knew the locations that they wanted to build these monuments at. They're not random locations.
And of course, although we've been talking about Egypt in particular, I mean, there's the global nature of these ideas and concepts. I mean, this is happening more or less all over the world. Maybe not exactly at the same time, but same within periods of time that we can link them together. And if these civilizations were discovering this knowledge, or simply they inherited this knowledge wherever it was coming from, if they developed it independently, that's one thing. But it's striking how many, despite the different designs, how many of structures, how many commonalities there are, which really has led, I suppose, to all the speculation about ancient civilizations being connected and seafaring and truly global in nature, and not the atomized, isolated situation that we're led to believe.
Yeah, from my research, and I mean, it does ties in nicely to Walter Crussenden, your previous guest, because I'm definitely on board with his cycles of consciousness as a good theory, because we haven't gone from primitive man straight to modern us, and we're like the best example of humans that have ever existed, because we've got a period in our history called the Dark Age and the Renaissance. So it isn't just this linear development model. And I think one of the things that we do is a grave injustice to our ancestors is assume that we're much more sophisticated in our thinking than they were. And if you want to measure humanity's growth just purely in terms of cars and computers, then no, I don't think they had that kind of technology. But anyone that can design the Great Pyramid and the incredible engineering in there, I mean, it really is mind-blowing, and many people have spoken about all of the features that are involved. But these were not backward-thinking people. They had a huge amount of knowledge, mathematics, geometry, and obviously had the architects and engineers, and they've made something that's lasted 5,000 years plus. So to think of them as these kind of primitive types is definitely not the right way of going. But if we give them more credit, then it's quite possible that our sciences will be able to pick up on some other things that we're missing in our daily lives.
Speaking of something that I feel we're missing in our daily lives, or perhaps something that's there that shouldn't be, when I was growing up, I liked playing with Lego, so I decided I was going to become an architect. That hasn't happened, but I still have a great interest in the built environment. And you're talking about architecture and geometry back in these times of these ancient civilizations. It was clearly very, very important, the design. It was key to everything. They might have had some purely functional structures, a grain store or something, but even then we can't be sure that a lot of thought didn't go into that. And out and about today, very rarely do you see any actual, what I would call, design when it comes to buildings. Most of the places we live and work are just boxes. Cities tend to be ill thought out. They evolve over long periods of time, and higgledy-piggledy, hodgepodge of this, that and the other thing. Very few actual attractive buildings. And even when we do construct something from scratch, like, for example, in the UK here, we think of something like Milton Keynes, what do we end up with? this horrible grid that looks like a typical American suburb. So it's just a little pet peeve of mine, but I just think if we put a lot more thought into our built environment, it would really improve our well-being.
Well, the difference between our modern mindset and the peoples that have been here previous to us is that they quite often, and particularly the indigenous people, even in today, try to find a way of living in harmony and leaving a minimum impact when they leave an area. I mean, you hear about the native peoples of America and Canada. When they take up their camp, they've been in an area, all that remains when they leave is the imprint of where their teepee was. Nothing else. They just leave it as they found it. Whereas our modern mindset is the idea that we are superior or somehow detached from nature, and so we can dominate it and bend it to our will and just flatten a forest, concrete over it, build tarmac roads and put houses up. And if people are lucky, they get a tiny garden out the back of the house. But we're not integrating building into nature. And of course, if we could do that, and we're starting to see these things, kind of the city farms on the rooftops of buildings and things, these little grassroots projects, there is a will for people, and of course city farms and things. But if it was done from the outset in a holistic planning way, and of course you're going to need to make a few compromises for practical, but part of us, our deep connection to this planet, our soul needs that connection, and otherwise we end up with a lot of anger, violent tendencies, because we're missing this connection that we really need for inner peace and that kind of interconnectedness. So cities can be quite destructive for us, you could say, on a spiritual level. And I always try and encourage people to get out into nature when their busy lives will allow them. I know some people obviously have these habits still, but probably others have forgotten how much we really do crave being in these amazing natural places like forests and by the sea.
Well, it's typical, isn't it? Like we were talking earlier on about New Age boutiques and what have you. Aside from your selection of crystals in there, another thing that certainly used to in the day of CDs, you used to proliferate in these places with like recordings of natural sounds, running water and forest ambience and things like that. And there's evidence to suggest that a lot of those natural sounds do make us feel better, even subliminally.
Well, this ties into a TV show that I'm working on a treatment for with Dr. Robert Schock, because certainly the sound of running water is very relaxing. But the other thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is that where there's running water like a waterfall or the oceans, that there's negative ions which we can measure, and positive ions are what computers and things generate, and they're not positive. It's the opposite to what you'd think. Positive ions are kind of destructive. Negative ions attach to positive ions in the air, and so germs and things are positively charged. Where you're in a waterfall generating a lot of negative ions, it will attach to dust particles and germs and things that are in the air, and it makes the positive ions too heavy and they drop to the floor. So that's the kind of how it works. And what ends up happening is you have a much higher level of oxygen, and the oxygen's a lot clearer, and so you re-oxygenate the body to a deeper level. So these places are amazing for creativity. So anyone that's an artist or a writer and has creative blocks, if you go to the ocean or waterfalls, the mountains, all of these places where the oxygen levels are a lot higher, you can really tune into your creativity in a deeper way. So I'm going to look at quite a few of these. How do we feel in a city compared to how we feel in a forest? And we can see a lot of these ancient sites that they were sort of tuning into the magnetism of the rocks, certain geologies where there's fault lines, these kind of there's a lot of energy moving under the surface, volcanoes. I heard from a volcanologist recently after one of my interviews, and she's the first person that I had a chance to talk to about consciousness and the connection with the volcanoes, because I did that test in Guatemala in 2012. I wanted to go up to the top of an active volcano where we know that there's a lot of energy flowing under the surface and see how I felt there in comparison to an Egyptian temple, where I always have these amazing meditations. Very similar. I mean, there's a lot of correlations between the two experiences. So the TV show is going to look at a lot of these subjects. We measure it with science. So there's lots of equipment around to measure some of these finer forces, and just to get people thinking how we feel in different natural environments. And yeah, look at some of these locations that our ancestors chose, and it looks like we're going to be able to start getting to the bottom of a few of the reasons why they did build some of these pyramid structures and mounds at certain places near rivers. So yeah, I'm quite excited about that one.
Have you had any experience with ionizers? Just in case people don't know, you can actually buy little devices that are supposed to pump out negative ions.
Yeah, there's one in the room with me now.
So that obviously you've had a good experience with that.
Yeah, I've got just a small one. I think cost about £15. I got it from Boots, so they're pretty easy to find. It sort of makes a little crackle. It's got these little electrodes, and I mean, it's hard to attribute anything in particular to it, but there have been a lot of science, and there's some interesting reports about athletes being trained by the Russians using negative ion therapy and things. So it's some pretty solid science that it does help us. So I just went along with that.
Well, it's something I considered. I just thought now was the time to ask, and you'd be the perfect person. And of course, you do have one, as I thought. We're talking about sound in ancient times, and it occurs to me another little bugbear I have when I'm, eyeing up all the ugly buildings in most cities is how much noise there is, and that's fair enough. Cars, thousands, sometimes millions of people all going about their daily business. Of course, going to generate a lot of sound. But I've read in many sources that not just to do with population, but that perhaps some ancient civilizations' life would have been less noisy. It would have been just quieter overall. People wouldn't have communicated so much or had the need to communicate quite so much. And there could be all sorts of reasons for that, whether it's crystal technology, telepathy, all sorts of speculations you can get into. It could be a whole other show. But it reminds me of another thing that's come up recently in a few interviews I've done, which is the limitations of language. And there's some speculation that language is merely a dumbed down version of singing, and that singing originally arose as spontaneous expressions of joy and delight. And over time, that's become dumbed down into what we now know as talking. And of course, we've been talking for so long that we now think in semantic terms. And that can really affect everything, really, your whole brain processes in terms of what language you know. And perhaps ancient peoples just thought in ways that we can barely comprehend.
Yes, and that is an area that I've been looking at because of my interest in the hieroglyphic symbols in Egypt. This pictorial language, for a better term, and I definitely look at the English language as pretty basic. It seems very wanting when you want to start to describe feelings and that kind of area. I can never find the sort of depth of the words in the English language to convey feelings, and so. If we write down a word, and I think a good example Schwaller de Lubitsch used was cat. So we have C-A-T, so we read cat. But in Egypt, they have a picture of a cat. So you look at the picture of cat, but you don't just think cat. You're looking at a picture of a cat, and you're thinking of the sound the cat made, or perhaps your favourite cat, your cat at home. So it's a different level of thinking involved in the symbol as opposed to the word. So there's definitely a correlation in how we're perceiving the world. And so the hieroglyphic language, when they're describing something with a series of pictures, is integrating differently in our heads. And from my experiences of the hieroglyphs, they were working on an entirely different level. So what we seem to have had handed down to us through the modern translations is the literal translation of the hieroglyphs. So that's one level of translation. But the initiate that was primed with how to decipher the hieroglyphs potentially would have 2, 3, 4 other layers of understanding for each of those hieroglyphs, depending on their level of training. So we've got a long way to go with that side of things. Yeah.
Well, we were talking earlier about the left-right brain split and how perhaps that's an unnatural state of affairs, and perhaps, as I say, leads to a lot of the problems we're experiencing globally at the moment. But it's interesting that the right brain thinking tends to be symbolic as opposed to semantic, and that we talked earlier about people like Einstein having sort of gestalt revelations of new concepts, and people like him reported, and Nikola Tesla, people like that reported that these insights tended to be in terms of symbols and pictures, and that they then sometimes had to struggle a great deal to try and integrate the ideas first of all, and then struggle even more to translate them into language so they could write them down and explain them to other people.
Which is, and this is basically an area that relates to the conference that I'm helping organise in July at Greenwich University, it's called the Eternal Knowledge Festival. So it's about the perennial philosophy, because the information, things that have lasted for thousands and thousands of years that are as relevant when they were first shared around the world, and things like the information that came back in the Renaissance, this information has lasted and is still relevant today. And some of it is relevant to our future, how we're going to build this sustainable model, because I think most of us have accepted we can't carry on how we are and expect the planet to be in a very good condition for perhaps even our children, but our grandchildren is not going to be in a good condition. So some of our habits we're going to have to improve drastically. So the point of this conference is to start digging back into this perennial philosophy. What are the other elements that our ancestors were aware of? What can we translate across? What helps us today? Because some information, of course, is difficult to use thousands of years afterwards, but the core of these subjects can still help us tomorrow, and there's a lot of people that are looking for those answers.
I think at the root of this, to go back to the brain split between the two hemispheres, at the root of this for me personally is that we've cut ourselves off from nature and, in fact, the entire universe in a way, in the sense that we view nature for the most part as hostile. We're to build fences to keep it in or to keep it out. Yeah. And we view the universe as fundamentally hostile. And I think that mindset leads to where we are today. And I'd follow on from that by saying that, like, for example, you're talking about the conference that you're hosting, and there are many other events like that over the world. And some people perhaps coming to this for the first time say, well, this esoteric information, this obscure stuff, it's interesting. Maybe you make a hobby out of it. Maybe some guys can make some money writing some books. But no, this is really important. And I think tying it in with Walter Cruttenden's interview he was on last week, really important at this time, because it affects how we view ourselves and the wider reality, and that changes everything.
Well, I help organise conferences in the US and the UK, so I get a different perspective on the audience and the people that attend. In America, these areas are definitely seem to be viewed a bit more in terms of educational things that can help us, things that can move us forwards. And in the UK, there does seem to be a bit more. It's kind of a sort of entertaining. I mean, you can never do a blanket analogy. Different people attend for different reasons, but that's the general feel that I've noticed. There's definitely different trends. And in terms of Walter's conference on the cycles, again, it's about getting back to this, the root of the information and what's relevant today. And we've all got our different areas of interest. So, of course, we have different speakers in London. We've got people connected to Oxford universities and these very reputable establishments. So it's definitely not all. You couldn't dismiss it all as esoteric information. There's certainly metaphysical subjects discussed as well, because we are trying to have this holistic approach. But it's important that the information is grounded. So wild speculation, which admittedly we've touched on a few things today, but I do like things that can be backed up through the sciences and give people something tangible to take away rather than just wild speculation, as entertaining as it can be.
Well, Gary, as we bring things to a close for today, perhaps you've talked about the conference and about the TV show that you're working up a treatment for, but just give listeners a bit more details, dates, websites, what have you, and if you've got any forthcoming tours you want to talk about, just anything you'd like to share.
Oh, thank you. Well, starting with Egypt, I'm off to Egypt in a few weeks. We've got a good group of people joining us, and there's still a few spaces left on there, and that's on my infinite-connections.co.uk website. You can see all of my tours listed under the Tours tab. So we've got Ireland and England in July. People can join just for the Ireland leg if they're living in England. Always happy to answer any questions about the tours, so please drop me a line via the contact form in the right-hand column on the website. Eternal Knowledge Festival, Greenwich University, and that is July 4th to 6th. There will be accommodation available on site if people want to travel down to see us. And at the moment, the ticket's £75 for Friday evening. Robert Bavell's our keynote speaker there. Saturday and Sunday, all for £75. So very reasonable. So we have 15 speakers. And we've got Adrian Gilbert, one of Robert Bavell's co-authors, Paul Devereaux, Karen Rawls, so say she's connected to Oxford, and Brian Forster's going to Skype in from Peru. I'll be giving my talk and probably doing a workshop on how you can actually feel the sound resonance. I can bring along something to give people a demonstration, because the best thing about sound resonance is that you can go to local yoga studios and meditation centres and go to gong baths. So I always encourage people to just give it a try, see how you feel. I think you'll enjoy it. I always do. And then I'll be in Peru September 15th to October 2nd. A group of us going over and we're going to do Nazca Lines, Sacred Valley, Machu Picchu, Bolivia, Pumapunku. So that's going to be an interesting tour. And then speaking at Palm Springs in California, and that's October 17th to 19th at CPAC with Walter Cruttenden. And then I'll be back in Egypt January 2015 with Robert Schock.
Wow, right into next year, and that will keep you busy. Well, Gary, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thanks for listening. Thanks, Greg.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please check out the website. That's legalizefreedom.com, legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programmes offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including world affairs, politics and economics, science and technology, religion and spirituality, conspiracy, and alternative history. You can also browse and buy a range of books and DVDs from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.